Is Atari still Atari? I've seen many comments talking about Infogrames with the recent announcement of the Atari box. I wanted to make a video on if Atari was still kind of Atari. Well, to answer this, we really have to go into what makes a company or a product that company or product. Is it just the name, or does it have to do with the people involved, or does it have to do with the product they make? We are first going to look at another scenario from another company / product. This would be Jeep. I'm sure many of you know what a Jeep is. I mean, from World War II to modern day, the Jeep is a Jeep. You know what you're looking at. Now, Jeep has had a very weird history, and we're going to go over it, but it's going to be very shortened, as I don't want to make this video completely about Jeep. We're talking about Atari, but this is just a similar scenario. U.S. Army wanted a light vehicle for World War II. They put out a competition. A company called Bantam won this competition. The problem was, Bantam only had one factory, and it was a small factory. They were in Upper Pennsylvania. You can actually go visit that factory still, I believe. Don't quote me on that. But, as Bantam only had one small factory, the U.S. Army instead gave Ford and Willys Overland, much bigger companies at the time, basically they were going to make the Jeep. So most of the Jeeps you see in World War II films, or when you World War II pictures and stuff, are either from Willys or Ford. You'll still see some made by Bantam. Like, Bantam was still able to turn out a couple, some. Not as many as Willys or Ford, but definitely some. Now, the Willys is probably the most iconic version of the Jeep, because Willys had control over it for most of the 1940s and 50s with the CJs, until Willys was merged with another company called Kaiser. The new company was renamed Kaiser Jeep. Kaiser Jeep was eventually bought by AMC, and was renamed to the Jeep Corporation. AMC was bought by Chrysler. Chrysler was merged with Daimler-Benz. And eventually, somehow, Jeep wound up in the hands of Fiat. But we still look at this and say, yes, that's a Jeep. It's still relatively the same kind of product that's been made since World War II. It's a 4x4 box vehicle, very boxy vehicle with a slotted grille. Sure, it's been modernized through years and time, but you still look at a Jeep and say, yes, that's a Jeep. You look at the history of the Jeep. So now we move on to, is Atari still Atari? Well, we're going to go through the history of Atari, and it's up for you to decide, kind of. Atari was founded in 1972 by Nolan Bushnell and some of his friends, and they produced things like the Pong arcade, and home versions of Pong. Now, this was before Nolan Bushnell sold Atari to Warner Communications in 1976. Under this, Warner Atari released the 2600 and the 5200. 2600 was released in 1977 and the 5200 in 1982. In 1978, Nolan Bushnell left Atari to start Chuck E. Cheese. After the video game crash of 1983, Warner Productions sold Atari in 1984 to the original founder of Commodore, Jack Tramiel. Sorry, his name is... I keep wanting to say Tamriel, like in Elder Scrolls, but no, it's Tramiel. Tramiel? Under the name Atari Corporation. Warner, however, retained the arcade division under the name Atari Games. With Atari now being split into two companies, Atari Corporation and Atari Games, we will go over them one at a time. First, we shall go over Atari Games, and then the Atari Corporation. Atari Games made cartridges for the Nintendo Entertainment System under the name Tengen. In 1989, Warner Communications merged with Time Inc. to form Time Warner, which then made Atari Games a subsidiary of Time Warner Interactive. Tengen was removed. In 1996, after an unsuccessful bid by the original Atari founder Nolan Bushnell, Atari Games was sold to WMS Industries. When Hasbro bought the Atari Corporation, Atari Games was renamed Midway Games West. Eventually, the new Midway Games West was disbanded in 2003, and Midway went defunct in 2010. A year before, in 2009, Midway was sold to Warner Brothers Entertainment, weirdly bringing at least a part of Atari kind of back to Warner. Now to go over the Atari Corporation. So we go back to 1984 with Jack Tramiel and his Atari Corporation. Jack had little interest in consoles. He was a PC Master Race kind of guy. Though, that's not saying his company didn't put out some consoles. The Atari Corporation released the Atari XE 8-bit computer and the Atari ST line of 16-bit. In 1986, the Atari Corporation launched two consoles. Both of these were designed under Warner Atari. The Atari 2600 Junior and the Atari 7800. In 1987, the Atari Corporation acquired Federated Group for $67.3 million. At this time, the Atari Corporation was being investigated by the FBI for the illegal reselling of Japanese DRAM chips in the U.S. This violated U.S. import laws. You know, those pesky import laws getting in the way of everything. Federated was sold in 1989 to Silo. Also in 1989, the Atari Corporation released the Atari Lynx handheld system. They had a shortage of parts that prevented the Lynx from having a nationwide launch. But soon, the Nintendo Game Boy was released. Atari opened a lawsuit saying Nintendo had an illegal monopoly since the Game Boy took market share from the Lynx. They lost this case. In 1993, the 64-bit Jaguar was released with its marketing ploy of do the math, since it had more bits than any other console released at the time. Some will say the Jaguar wasn't a true 64-bit system since it used two 32-bit processors named Tom and Jerry. It also featured a Motorola 68000 as a manager. The Jaguar was a beast for its time when it was released. The problem with it being a beast back then was it was complex, and most third-party developers didn't want to support it. Despite this, the Jaguar had some really good games. Tempest 2000, Alien vs. Predator, Iron Soldier, and the best port of Doom. Atari even released the Jaguar CD add-on that allowed the Jaguar to use CDs, though it looks like a space toilet. And it's a pretty fragile piece of technology. Sadly, the Jaguar was discontinued in 1996, only selling around 250,000 units. After it was cancelled, the Jaguar molds were used in dentistry equipment. In 1996, Jack Tramiel and his family left the company. While it was profitable through a series of lawsuits and investments with millions of dollars in the bank, they had enough of it. After Tramiel left, it was eventually merged with JTS Inc. They were a hard drive manufacturer, but just weeks after they merged, they were completely bankrupt. JTS sold the Atari Corporation's intellectual property to Hasbro Interactive, and the name to THQ. In 2001, Infogrames purchased Hasbro Interactive. It was then renamed Infogrames Interactive. In 2008, Infogrames bought Atari Inc. and merged with it. Also in 2008, Infogrames bought Cryptic Studios. Cryptic Studios were made up of previous Atari Games veterans. Cryptic Studios made City of Heroes, Champions Online, and Star Trek Online. Namco Bandai acquired Atari Europe from Infogrames in 2009. Also in 2009, Infogrames changed its name to Atari. In 2010, the original founder of Atari, Nolan Bushnell, along with Tim Verdon, joined the company's board of directors. In 2013, the new Atari filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. It was then bought by Fred Chesnais, who has made it profitable through the selling of old retro games on both Steam and mobile platforms, partnering with a company called Perry Play to make Atari-branded lottery tickets and gambling machines. Now, with the recent announcement of the Atari box, Fred Chesnais has said he wanted to make Atari great again. This new Atari is made up of Atari, Atari London Studios, Atari Interactive, and Atari Inc. This brings us to today, and the question we are asking, do we still consider this new Atari to be Atari? I mean, it's technically not the original Atari, just like as the original Jeep is not the Jeep of today. But we still look at Jeep and say, that is a Jeep. Should we do the same for Atari, or shouldn't we? If this new company wants to make similar products to the original Atari, being video games and consoles, do we consider them Atari, or not? Is it only the name that matters, or is it the people working there? Or is it the product? I mean, the Atari that released the Jaguar wasn't the same one that released the 2600, but people still call those two Atari consoles. Alright, that is all. If I get anything wrong, please just tell me. I'm doing a lot of this at 3 a.m. or was doing a lot of it at 3 a.m. So, very quick research. I'll have everything I used in the description.
I think I might miss him.
The wind catch you, elf? I do not go willingly to Moor's impression. More accursed than a faithless comrade. There's an assassin. Borga, get up with Telgi. Potion here. Help me. Storm vermin.
Don't you feel it? The weave rebels. There's poison on the wind.
Kill that thing! Getting low! attention here!
Lilius, I have failed you.
They landed a good blow on you, I tell you.
Follow me! This way!
Don't be fooled. They're still about.
Fall back! I'm hurting!
Stay with me, Kluber. Sigmar guides me this way. It's got a long reach. Pathmaster is down.
Watch out! Rattling gunner! The gunner's dead!
Clear. Stand clear. This way. Good shot for a lumberfoot.
Move! This way!
A good kill. Guess I need to be faster.
Join your
Heavy for
regiment
an elf.
in Moor's realm.
Hurry! This way.
The Strangler dies! Now! Watch out! Hook rat's coming! Good shot!
Don't relax. That's when
Guys,
if you're badly injured. What for? Yeah! Move ahead, Sergeant. Assassin's dead. Watch for others. Quick, right, we're not safe yet.
This way, Lumberfoots!
Looks like a once-upon-a-time brat got lost in the woods. No loss there.
Hurry, across the bridge.
Your willpower is failing you, Saltspire.
Come on, you need to reach this bridge.
Hush, Kerbelan. You've known worse than this.
This better taste good.
Ring that bell.
Die, creature.
Cheery sound, but it brings us grim work, Dory. Time to heal, Paul. Thanks, Kruger.
Take out the rattling gunner. One more dead rattling.
I'm not long for this world.
Don't leave me with the elf and the witch, Sergeant.
One for a skinny elf. Backstabbers about.
Prepare for poison gas.
It's on me! Move, gas! I hear a woman. We got the assassin! There are more Raki to kill, Sergeant. Stay alert. There's a gas rat.
Blood and fur. Delightful.
One is down. Incoming. Keep back.
Not a good sign. Stand well back.
Let's drive down with the jar on that pretty face, can we?
order you not to die, Sergeant.